I have just a few announcements for those of you who are requesting credit. Please note that to receive CE credit, you must remain logged into the video portion of the webinar for the entire program. Logging into the audio portion only is not sufficient for CE credit. Continuing education credits are being offered for the following designations: CPE, CIMA, CPWA, CIMC, RMA, CFP, and SHRM. Also, at the end of the webinar, we would like to request that all attendees fill out the evaluation form that will pop up. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. At the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many questions as we can, but we want to be respectful of your schedule and end on time. If we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you afterwards. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. So let's get started. We are joined today by Kate Blake, Learning and Development Manager at Pentegra. Kate has been with us since the beginning of her career, where she started in the retirement benefits field. And being the quick learner and talented contributor that she is, Kate quickly arose into various positions within Pentegra. Kate's been able to exemplify her deep roots of industry expertise in each position that she's held, and her skills have always been the perfect complement to Pentegra's culture. Kate, I'll now turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lizzie, and thank you everybody for taking the time out of your schedules this afternoon to join us for a riveting discussion of investment policy statements in retirement plans. Now, I personally think that this is the perfect topic for October because, we don't have a lot of firm guidance on investment policy statements. We spend a lot of time thinking about plan documents and maintenance and amendments and restatements and all that good stuff. And we don't really think about the IPSs too much. So it's a little spooky. It's a little unknown, but we'll try to clear out the ghosts and the goblins from the corners and demystify this topic a little bit for you. So we got a packed agenda today. I'd like to tee things up just by kind of zooming out and focusing on the history and purpose of DC investment policy statements. Then we'll take a look at changing trends, regulations, and market conditions that might impact traditional IPS language. We'll look at potential IPS gaps and problems that may occur and that you may want to look out for. We'll talk about managed accounts and IPS considerations, potential IPS updates that may be coming down the pipeline, and changes for DC plans to consider, although there's nothing firm just yet. Then we'll wrap up and take any questions that anybody may have, and please feel free to enter them in the chat box as we go through today's presentation. So we'll kick things off, as I mentioned, with just a brief look at the history and purpose of an IPS. The first trustee-directed DC investment policy statements, and I'm talking back in the day in the 1970s when ERISA came out, in the 1980s when 401ks started gaining traction, they were pretty short. And so kind of a fun little known fact about our MEDC program, which is our multiple employer defined benefit or defined contribution plan for financial institutions. I think that plan today has, I want to say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 27 to 28 different investments, inclusive of all of the target date funds. But back in the day, when the MEDC was first created in 1970, there were two funds. It was a stable value fund and the S&P 500 fund. So yeah, there wasn't too much to talk about in the way of an investment policy statement. It was a coin toss of a choice as far as how your money was going to be invested. And then as we move through the 80s, lots of relatively high interest rate CDs were common in these types of plans. And then the original DC IPS came out post 404C when we started around the 1990s to see these plan types, again, continue to gain traction. And also we started to see more participant investment direction and a greater menu of funds started to come online and become available. We headed into the 2000s, things really ramped up. We started to see daily valuation plans. I mean, that's the norm today, but back in the day, not so much. Mutual fund proliferation and the growth of just tons of different options and fund companies, and of course, tech-fueled growth. This is around the time when we started to see increased ERISA fiduciary-related litigation. Pre-DOL rule, organizations kind of sped up the process to professionalize the IPS. This is around 2010, 2015. We start seeing companies propping up to handle these types of documents and handle 338 fiduciary outsourcing, which you can see in the next item here. We started to see more 338, which is discretionary trustee services in our larger plans. And we started to see more 321 directed trustee services crop up in our smaller plans, at which time we started to see many, many more IPSs start coming online in these plans, especially the larger ones. And here, this is now a standard in the IPS. Now, I don't think everybody in the industry has an IPS, and I don't think that everybody in the industry necessarily needs an IPS. Maybe there is a tiny one participant, profit sharing plan out there for a solopreneur. That's a different situation. But the vast majority of plans these days have or should have an IPS in place. But the purpose of today's webinar, and something that we should integrate into our discussions with our clients, is the question, maybe not exactly phrased as it is on this slide, but does our IPS still meet the need of the client? And to that, we should really just take a step back and look to the first tenet of ERISA. The primary responsibility of fiduciaries is to run the plan solely in the interest of participants. And this is where an IPS can really come in handy, because what we're trying to accomplish with this document is that it creates a tool and a process to help make good investment decisions around this participant menu. Something else that we should consider when we're thinking about IPSs and investment fund menus in our client plans is this plan a primary or secondary retirement account, and how has the role of this plan changed over time? Have investments and has the IPS kept pace with those changing needs? Like I gave you the example of the two-fund MEDC plan back in the day. That at that time was a secondary retirement vehicle to a more traditional pension plan. The MEDC plan today and most of our 401k plans today are now the primary retirement vehicle. And as a result, many of them have greatly expanded fund menus to offer participants the opportunity to create asset allocations that will set them up for retirement success. So that brings us to our first polling question. Which statement regarding an IPS is true? A, all plans must have an IPS. B, an IPS must be filed with the Department of Labor. C, the IPS must be attached to the Form 5500. Or D, an IPS is not required.
The poll will be up for another 15 seconds for anyone who has not selected an answer. The poll is now closed. The correct answer was D, an IPS is not required.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. And this is where it comes into sort of a spooky territory, because as we've said, these plans for so many folks are their retirement, their retirement nest egg, their primary vehicle. However, the regulation around investments in DC plans has not kept pace with those changing needs of Americans. So it's not required, but it is strongly recommended. Now, with that said, it's not necessarily a set it and forget it thing. From time to time, we should review our IPS. From time to time, we need to perhaps make changes to our IPS. So let's talk about changing trends, regulations, market, and macro conditions that might impact our document. We could probably do an hour-long webinar on each one of these bullet points, but we don't have time for that today. So let's just focus on a couple of these. On the left-hand side, we've got trends that we're seeing that might impact an IPS. And on the right side, we've got regulations. On the left-hand side here, personalization and advice. A lot of plans these days offer managed account services or advice services. How do those services reflect the spirit of the IPS? I think that this is an important question and an often overlooked question because a lot of times the IPS may be prepared by one entity and investment advice might be rendered by somebody else. For example, your 338 discretionary trustee may prepare the IPS, and you may have an advisor or perhaps a record keeper offering investment advice or educational resources. Those different groups and people all need to be on the same page about what we're trying to do here. Hybrid QDIA. This is something that we've started to see gain some traction in the marketplace and in the news. This is the idea that maybe it doesn't have to necessarily be a one or the other situation between putting all of your money in, say, a target retirement fund or choosing a managed account solution. A hybrid QDIA could look like having a target date fund series as a default, as I think 90% or more of plans have these days. But the difference is that your hybrid QDIA, if it's a TDF, it could be maybe age-based. Under a certain age, you're in just a, traditional TDF solution. But as you age into retirement, your account transitions from just a basic TDF into a managed style account. But even though this is gaining traction in the marketplace, if you Google hybrid QDIA, you will see tons and tons of companies out there who are releasing products like this. And they're pitching them to plan sponsors. And in many cases, they're options worth considering. But has the IPS been updated? Again, maybe not, because it might be different entities who are pitching this product versus managing your investment policy statement. And we got to, again, make sure we're all on the same page. Retirement income. And what this is really driving at, this one and the next bullet point, are two separate points, I think, that are equally important. Number one, do you have a diversity of asset classes available in your fund menu? I mean, that's one of the primary goals of an IPS, is to make sure that you have a sufficient menu that is in the best interest of plan participants. Can it adequately provide for varying needs, whether it be, retirement income, maybe lifetime or guaranteed income, or non-guaranteed income options? Are those all present in the plan? Are they all documented in the IPS? And then also income and target date funds. So what types of target date funds are selected in your plan? There's as many hybrid QDIA options as there are available. There's probably twice as many TDF options available. And they all have different underlying investments and different glide paths providing, varying levels of retirement income. So does the TDF, even if you're just using a basic model, does it match with both employer needs and participant demographics? And participant demographics and employer needs are things that change over time. And that's why an IPS is not necessarily a static document. Now, I don't think that we necessarily need to be pulling up our IPS and looking at it with a magnifying glass every day while we drink our morning coffee. That's probably overkill. But effective plan governance, as you can see at the bottom here, that's really the key. So maybe you print it out, the IPS, and bring it along to your next annual plan review. And at the end of this webinar, I have some recommendations on how you can introduce a discussion like that as well. The other thing to keep an eye out for are regulations. 404C and QDIA are kind of long in the rearview mirror at this point and status quo for most of us, but they have shaped the landscape in which we exist today. Fiduciary and best interest rules have been around, coming and going in various discussions for a while now, and ESG and other alternative asset classes have as well. They've gotten a lot of political attention and attention in the news media. There may be forthcoming regulations coming in conjunction with Secure 2.0 around things like benchmarking, around things like, well, we have regulations around things like emergency savings accounts. These are all things to keep in mind as we're reviewing our IPS. The other thing to think about that might impact an IPS would be market conditions. So it's not just employer and employee demographics, trends, and regulations, but what's going on out there in the world. This is a chart that I used to like to show in my employee education meetings to illustrate why we shouldn't be chasing returns. It's just showing the annual return in blue here of the Bloomberg US Aggregate Bond Index. It had, as you can see in the caption here, its worst year ever in 2022 and its first consecutive negative years on record. So what we want to make sure we offer to manage these market conditions, as we said already, is a broad basket of asset classes so that participants have adequate choice to make the decisions that work for them. And just to loop back around to something I said earlier, that we loop in record keepers and advisors and everybody's on the same page to educate participants about those options that are available. Something else that we've also seen, and I want to talk about just because I'm showing a bond index here that's interesting, and it also relates to market conditions. This growth in technology, proliferation of fund managers, and just the sheer number of different funds and fund types that are available today. A long time ago, 401k plans maybe had, as I mentioned, like one stock fund, one stable value fund, and maybe one bond fund. Now we're seeing disaggregation of some of these asset classes and more funds come online. So something that we've seen and something that I see in a lot of the plans that we work with here, instead of just having one bond fund, maybe there are two or even three. Maybe there's a US bond fund, an international, a short term, a long term. I see an increase in choice in the asset classes that are offered in these different retirement plans. And that too should be accounted for in the IPS. Other things to consider, we've already talked about this first bullet point here, but what is the actual role of the plan? So is this just an ancillary plan? So maybe you have a different type of IPS for, say, just a 457 plan for key employees than you do for your 401k plan that's available for everybody. Also, think about the menu. Does it have the right types of investments? Managed accounts for retirees? Would it help participants to easily see the benefits they're funding for and how their portfolio is set up to meet those goals? So this again ties back in with education. How can we get the information that's in the IPS about the different asset classes that are available to participants in a way that makes sense for them? Again, it comes down to plan governance. This brings us to our next polling question. Which investment options can be addressed in the IPS? A, managed accounts. B, mutual funds. C, collective investment trusts. Or D, all of the above.
The poll will be open for another 15 seconds. Poll is now closed. The correct answer was D, all of the above.
Great. Thanks so much. So the IPS can be a wide-reaching tool that can help us ensure that the overall fund menu that we're offering in the plan is adequate for the needs of participants, is adequately monitored on a periodic basis, and is appropriately documented in writing. But the IPS is not perfect. It is not necessarily a silver bullet. So let's talk about some potential gaps and issues that sometimes we see when we're working with IPSs. I think this first one is really interesting. So Shahab avoidance, and as we wrote in the little sub-bullet point here, overly protected fiduciary, stuck in process but safe, traditional minded. So what does this mean? Well, sometimes we see clients who say, okay, well, we can't make any changes to our fund menu because our IPS doesn't provide for it. We're not even going to necessarily look at any changes. Well, if that client originally drafted their IPS in 2005 and they were so change averse that they, just kept it in its same form again because they felt that, they have it and why fix what's not broken? Well, now they're going to be 20 years on and they might not have a fund menu that is reflective of the modern investing environment. As we said, fund menus have changed a lot over the decades. So we can't necessarily assume that just because we have an IPS, we don't need to think about it, we're good, and our investment fund menu is set. The investment fund menu is a living, breathing sort of creation here. The other concern is anchoring and process myopia. So basically trying to say it's easy to benchmark the same thing over and over and over again. So does your fund menu really have diversity of choice? Or are you just sticking to, a couple of very safe, basic index funds? Not to say that there's anything wrong with index funds, but the modern investor may be looking for a variety of asset classes, a variety of index and actively managed funds in a fund menu. And again, if we just anchor to one specific process and we refuse to review and adjust our process as the market and as investment conditions and as technology changes, we may miss the mark and not even realize it. Now, that's not to say we should have every single fund in our retirement plan just because it's out there and it looks cool. Again, the investment policy statement exists to try to determine what is right for the specific need, but the need changes over time. And then rear view mirror. So we don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future with asset classes that are now coming down the pipeline. I mentioned ESG before. There's also a wide variety of alternative asset classes. AI is, taking off. We'll surely see some funds out there that are focused on that. How do we know in the future what is going to be worth adding to a fund menu? It's hard to know, but that's where that periodic review comes in, where we don't just create this and stick it on a shelf. It's a living, breathing document that we look at annually. Another thing that's worth considering are benchmarks. There used to be no tools to benchmark. Now there are tons of tools out there. That's not necessarily a good thing. Now it could more be a question of how do I choose the right benchmark of the universe that's out there. The DOL and IRS are looking for more nuanced benchmarks, although they have yet to release any firm guidance on that. Target date funds present a unique issue when it comes to benchmarking in qualified retirement plans. 51%, I'm just reading off a statistic here that I think is interesting. This is from Morningstar. 51% of target date funds out there use the S&P Target Date Fund Index as their benchmark. But what that means is that there are 49% of employers out there who are using something different. And I don't have the graph in this chart, but if you pull it up, it's a benchmarking report from Morningstar. It shows probably a full page of the remaining 49% of employers and what they're using for benchmarks. Some of them have no benchmark or don't know what they're using. Some employers, actually a pretty decent percentage of employers, were using the S&P 500 to benchmark target date funds, which comes with its own set of nuance and potential problems. So this lack of a standard benchmark, as this investment marketplace has become more complex, is complicated. Who chooses the benchmarks and asset classes, and how does that impact plans? Well, they're defined in your IPS. And this is really key, because if you use a different benchmark that maybe is more suitable, well, all of a sudden, now your fund performance may appear in a completely different light. So it's important to make sure that not only do we have the appropriate asset classes represented in our investment fund menu, but that our IPS also assigns the appropriate benchmarks. Because if we're using something, I'm going to pick on, again, this S&P 500 fund that a lot of employers are using to benchmark a TDF. If you're using an S&P 500 fund to benchmark a target retirement income fund, well, guess what? It's probably always going to underperform relative to the benchmark, because you might not have selected an appropriate benchmark. So this is an important component of the discussion as well. Another important component of the discussion has to do with managed accounts. And it's important for totally different reasons. With the target date funds, we're trying to benchmark a QDIA that has a variety of different iterations. There's, anywhere from an income fund all the way up to a 2070 or maybe even a 2075 fund for some providers these days. So we're trying to fit a variable product into an appropriate benchmark. But managed accounts have different considerations. And when I'm talking about managed accounts here, I'm talking about either a participant going and creating their own asset mixture, or many providers and advisors have services that do that on behalf of participants. So it's a custom portfolio, either created by the participant or created by a vendor or retirement partner or advisor. An IPS rarely, if ever, discusses available participant advice offerings in a lot of detail in the IPS. And I think that this too reflects a lack of alignment between the people who are providing education and advice relative to the plan and the 321 or 338 investment manager. It may be worth reviewing an IPS and making mention of participant advice offerings to close that gap. This is also an area where it's important, again, just to consider the role of these plans and how they have changed in terms of participant reliance on them as a primary source of retirement income. There are potential disconnects in asset classes in the QDIA, IPS, and managed accounts. So what I'm trying to say here is a QDIA, maybe if it's a target date fund, maybe going one direction with regard to asset allocation and its glide path. A managed account or a participant with a managed account may be going in a completely different allocation direction. The participant, if we take two participants in those scenarios, they could have identical needs and risk profiles, but just by virtue of landing in different investments, could ultimately have totally different portfolios. This can impact the demand for portfolio personalization, investment fund options, and things of that nature. If there are managed account options available in any of these retirement plans that we're working with, it's important to get that message out to participants and make mention of it in the IPS. This raises an important question. Why is it almost always TDS or managed account? TDS are not usually offered through an advisor. They're usually offered through a mutual fund vendor. Very few managed accounts or other advisors use TDS in their advice. So this is really just to drive home the perspective that if I'm a participant and I go into a target date fund, it's suiting a need. Maybe it's a QDIA in the plan. It's giving me a suitable portfolio for a hypothetical person, but it's not tied to my specific goals as a participant. It's not measured. It's not managed. And as a result, may have elevated risks. This doesn't always make it into either a TDS or, this information doesn't always make it into an IPS, and it doesn't always also make it to participants. So with that in mind, let's think forward and look at some potential IPS updates and changes for DC plans to consider. These plans have changed a lot over the years. It's normal to review your plans periodically, like we said. When we do an annual plan review, we look at plan provisions, we look at compliance testing, we make sure that the 5500 was filed. We should consider adopting a similar mindset with our IPS. Plan documents are amended all the time, so why don't we do the same thing with our IPS? And most importantly, what's the right process? Discuss and document any changes. How can we help employers show that they researched these topics effectively and decided one way, decided not to do something, or maybe decided not to decide? The bottom line is make sure any decisions are well researched and documented and aren't trend chasing. This is one of the biggest reasons to have an IPS in my mind. I used to do employee education meetings, and some of the most common questions that I would get during those meetings are, well, why doesn't my 401k fund menu have this fund or that fund? And a lot of times, as you can probably imagine, it was very much trend chasing. I would get people coming up to me looking for some sort of hot commodity fund or, AI or something along those lines that a lot of times might not necessarily be something that is appropriate to have in a 401k plan or that specific 401k plan. If there's no IPS in place, an employer who's doing an education meeting because they're trying to do the right thing by employees might hear those comments and might think, oh no, we're getting employee complaints about our fund menu. Maybe we should offer these trend chasing, hot investments that people are chatting about. The IPS lays the groundwork for preventing that mistake. Because again, the IPS specifically dictates what asset classes, what funds, what monitoring criteria we're using to oversee those funds so that we don't get, over exuberant about trends and employee suggestions during education meetings. Here we go. Another thing that we should consider is how we can better integrate the income benefit of target date funds, managed accounts, and the DC IPS. So a target date fund glide path has an assumed target benefit and other assumptions that inform the investment allocations in each of the funds, but this is not really visible to participants. There are a lot of resources available out there that participants could use, But a lot of times investment allocation decisions that they make just simply aren't tied to these resources or any illustrations or any research. A lot of times participants make decisions based on emotion. So how can we help participants DIY with a risk profile that informs their accounts? Or should they just be given a default risk profile, target, benefit, and UDIA investment? I think that the answer to those questions is probably going to be different depending on the individual employer. So I think that when you meet with your clients, bring up the conversation. Next time you have an annual review, bring the IPS along with you and ask your clients. And you can also look at, participant demographics and investments to help inform this discussion. But ask them, what do you feel your clients, your employees need? What do you feel they're doing? Do you feel that they're aware of all of the options that are available to them? Because that can help inform your decisions about what asset classes should be offered, specifically what funds should be offered. And it can even inform decisions as granular as what type of glide path should we offer in our target retirement funds. And this brings us to our third polling question. When should an IPS be reviewed and amended? A, when market conditions fundamentally change. B, when an investment option is replaced. C, when the IRS requires the IPS to be amended. Or D, when an auto-escalate deferral feature is added.
The poll will be open for another 15 seconds. The poll is now closed. The correct answer was A, when market conditions fundamentally change.
Great. Thanks so much, Lizzie. And I think that that's important to really drive home because, again, even though we might want to bring this to our annual plan review meeting once a year, bring the IPS, we don't need to make changes to it every year. Just like the plan document, we might review it every year, but we don't necessarily amend it every year. But when there's a need, like when participant needs change, employer needs change, or when market conditions fundamentally change, then we might want to consider making updates to our IPS. Okay, so this next part and the slide after this, I think this is kind of the fun part. So we know we need to talk about this stuff with clients. Maybe we talk about it annually. We bring the document with us. Bring with you to print out the IPS, bring a highlighter to your client meeting, and bring a little printout with these words on it. And use these three things to facilitate a discussion. What you want to do is open the IPS and do a little word search game with clients. And you're going to look for words like personalization, advice in the IPS. And each one of these words obviously has an important meaning. Talk about this meaning with clients, and this is really going to give you the inside scoop on their needs, the status of the IPS, if any changes need to be made. Like we said before, a lot of plans offer managed accounts, advice, educational resources, but it's not linked in with the IPS to close the loop. So you might find that personalization and advice aren't mentioned anywhere in the IPS. Same with managed accounts. Maybe the word digital is not mentioned, but maybe it should be, because maybe that can give plan sponsors and employers additional information about where to find, for example, benchmarking information, employee advice, and educational resources. Is the word QDIA mentioned in the IPS? It probably is, but that can help you facilitate maybe a different discussion. So like we said, What target date fund series are you using, Mr. Client? What are your employee needs? And let's look at that glide path that you're using in the fund family that you've selected. Does that work for your needs? So you can see how you can go through each one of these items and it'll lead to a discussion. We can just pick one more. Let's say benchmarks. I have another fun fact for you. 8 and 10 respondents in the Callan 2024 DC Trends survey reported using multiple benchmarks. So that could be a discussion in and of itself. Maybe does a benchmark need to be changed? If so, why? And all these other words too, of course, have meaning. Are any keywords missing? So if there are any words that resonate with a client that are important to them or important to participants and they're not in the IPS, consider how can we integrate that language into the document to better reflect the employer needs and employee demographics. Number 4, watch your A, B, C, and D in the IPS. So this is the second thing that you can bring to your client meetings when you bring the IPS. Start by doing the little game that we just talked about. But I will say that might leave a client feeling, oh man, like there's a lot to unpack here. Where do I go from here? That's when you whip this A, B, C, D out of your bag of tricks and you say, I got you. This is what we're going to do going forward. A, B, C, and D of the IPS are the key things that you want to consider when you're looking at these documents. Asset classes, benchmarks, criteria, and data points. So asset classes. Do we have all of the major asset classes represented in our IPS? A couple of questions that I think are important here. What's our balance of accumulation to decumulation choices? We want to make sure that we have a balanced array of funds available to participants. Benchmarks. Question that jumps out to me here is how are TDS going to be impacted? Because again, we can tell there's a lot of discrepancy out there in how people are benchmarking these plans, especially those TDS. And we have heard from the government that there may be more information forthcoming about benchmarks. So this is really an area to keep an eye on as we move forward. Criteria. So how are we scoring our funds? Is that appropriate? Have we considered any changes to our investment scoring criteria? Now, this information can be obtained from either the 338 discretionary trustee or the 321 directed trustee. Now, that may be you yourself if you happen to be serving in that function for your clients. And whether it's you or whether it's a 338 outsourced vendor, you want to make sure that there is an appropriate monitoring process in place. We haven't really spent too much time talking about this today, but I do want to mention it because this is a critical linchpin of an IPS. You can have an appropriate fund menu. You can have all the necessary asset classes. You can appropriately benchmark your funds, and you can have all of this in writing. But if you're not looking at and monitoring these funds, then you're not closing the loop. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do for our process here, just as an example of what you might want to hear from a 338 discretionary trustee in terms of the type of process that we have. You'll want to hear them say something to the effect of, we monitor based on qualitative and quantitative criteria. So are they looking at different factors? Here we look at things like short, medium, and long-term performance. We look at who is the fund manager. Have there been any changes at that fund manager? If so, why? What's the average tenure? If there have been changes, do we think that that's going to impact the performance of the fund? Is the fund actually doing what it says it's going to do? In other words, is it keeping with its investment objectives? And we look at each of these 8 different criteria on a quarterly basis, and then we rate them. If any fund fails 2 or more of our criteria, we place it on what we call a watch list. A fund has to stay on the watch list for at least 2 quarters. It cannot exceed a certain number of quarters. If it does, we will boot it out of the fund menu and replace it with something else. So that type of monitoring criteria, whether, whatever it be, needs to be in existence, it needs to be documented, and it needs to be adhered to on a consistent basis in order to close the loop operationally on your IPS. And then data points. So what data is used to build this menu? What data is used to choose the appropriate TDS fund series and to establish these managed account portfolios and procedures? So what are your inputs? What are your, employee demographics? So review all of this when you meet with the client. Review some of these questions. We've spoken about some of these already. For example, what's the role of the plan? The next one, this is kind of a symbolic bullet point, but I think it's interesting that it's in this presentation. Consider your plan name for your clients. What is the name of your client's plans, and can it be better? And I kind of use better with air quotes around it. Can it adequately reflect the needs or the intent of the plan? So I'm just going to go back to some of these words, like, for example, income. Does the retirement plan say that in the name? If not, does the employer want it to? Would that better reflect their wishes and desires for this plan? Sometimes putting that into words and into writing can kind of help solidify the vision that employers have for their plan. And of course, this is always a time just to consider the high-level objectives of the plan and make sure that they're current, and to look at the plan goals and make sure that those are current as well. All right, this brings us to our final polling question. What are the A, B, C, and D's of an investment policy statement? A, allocations, benchmarks, criteria, and data points. B, assets, benchmarks, criteria, and data points. C, allocations, benchmarks, costs, and data points. And D, assets, benchmarks, costs, and data points.
The poll will be open for another 15 seconds for anyone who has not yet selected an answer. Poll is now closed. The correct answer was B, assets, benchmarks, criteria, and data points.
Great, thanks so much. And having the A, B, C's, and D's along with your little word search activity and discussion, I think are 2 actionable ways to really drive this information home for clients in your annual plan review and other meetings with them, and really illustrate the point again that this is a living document. It's not something that we just draft once. We draft it and then we periodically review, make changes as necessary, and also ensure that we have appropriate monitoring criteria in place that we are consistently adhering to. All right, so with that, we'll wrap up and open it up for any questions that may have come into the chat. Lizzie, did we get anything?
Thanks so much, Kate. Yes, we did. So I'll start off with the first one. Do most 401k plan sponsors have an IPS, and are there any downsides to having one?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So thank you for asking that, because it's giving me an opportunity to use a stat that I had but didn't use throughout today's presentation. So according to the 2024 Plan Sponsor Council of America survey, 82% of plans do have an IPS. So it is something that is very common, although it's not seen across the board. Like I said at the top of this webinar, I think it's appropriate for the vast majority of retirement plan sponsors, but again, there's always outliers if you have that type of solopreneur out there. Maybe they don't necessarily need one. But if you are a large employer, if you you know, have any sort of participant directed investments and have a wide range of participant demographics in your plan, it's definitely something worth considering. In terms of downsides, that's kind of an interesting question too. And I guess I'll just go back to this slide here relative to the procedural issues. So, I mean, once you create an IPS, yeah, you're managing it. So it's another thing that you do need to just add to the task list, add to the agenda during the annual plan review. But overall, I think that that's a relatively minor downside compared to, all of the upsides that come along with having one in place.
Excellent. And another question. Can you give an example of a fundamental change in the market conditions that would result in an update to the IPS?
Oh, that's an interesting one because I think I mentioned those words exactly before, and I'm not surprised that somebody called me out for an example on that one. But I don't want my answer to sound like a cop out, but I will say I think it's easier to look in hindsight. It's hard to say what would be a potential market disruptor in the future that would necessitate a change in IPS because, I mean, we haven't seen it yet. But I guess I'll just call on a couple of historical examples. Maybe the rise of TDF. I would say I really started to see them crop up, say like post 2008, 2010, around then. I mean, that is a big change compared to, like I said before, just, a two-fund solution or a very small investment menu. It's a change in philosophy. It's a change in default. That would definitely necessitate a change in IPS. So if we ever saw something in the future that was like an industry-wide move to another model, perhaps, of a default investment, that would definitely necessitate a change. And then I suppose the other historical example that I'll call on, I kind of briefly mentioned, would be maybe the disaggregation of certain asset classes. As I mentioned, back in the day, we had the S&P 500 fund and we called it a day in our MEDC plan. But since then, now we've got that one, we've got a large cap growth, large cap value, a mid cap, a small cap, an international fund, and all of those are equity funds. So any sort of disaggregation into maybe market cap size or investment strategy relative to growth and value funds, if that's being added to a fund menu that previously was maybe pretty simple, I would say that would probably necessitate a change in IPS as well. But aside from that, it's kind of like a we'll know it when we see it kind of thing.
Great, thank you. Another question. Are participant demographics ever taken into consideration when designing an IPS?
Oh, wow, that's a really good one. And I would say the answer is probably not nearly as often as they should be. I think that they're really not. I think most of the conversations that I have with employers around IPSs and around fund menus tend to be more aligned with, are we offering a low-cost solution that covers all of the major asset classes? And while I think that is an acceptable answer, I think maybe there's more to it. And I'll come back to the target date funds again. There's just dozens and dozens of iterations of target date funds out there. A lot of people will just choose, the lowest cost provider or a big name provider that feels, relatively safe. And again, I don't think there's anything necessarily inherently wrong with that decision as long as you can justify it. But I've seen wildly different glide paths in different TDF models between different fund providers. So I think that that's an area where you can look at participant demographics. Do they tend to be a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more conservative with their investments? That type of insight can help you pick a target date series that might be more appropriate for your employees than maybe if you just chose some type of default based on, name recognition or something to that effect. So short answer is probably not, but I think that's something that we should look to more in the future.
Great, thank you. Another question. Is there ever a time when an IPS is no longer needed? If so, can you please provide some examples?
That's an interesting question as well, and one that nobody's ever really asked me before, but I would say once you have your IPS in place, as long as your plan is in place, it probably makes sense to keep that document in place and update it as well. Unless, maybe the plan is terminating, but that's the only situation that I can think of.
Right, great. And should DB plans also consider an IPS, or are they only needed for 401k plans?
Oh yeah, this presentation was very DC specific, and I think that's intentional because these are participant directed accounts, so it really matters what investments we offer. These have been, because they're participant directed, they do tend to be a target for litigation. So it is important that employers make sure that they protect themselves and offer appropriate funds. The DB world is a little bit different because it's not participant directed. So you don't have those same types of risks. However, they're not, where the participant risks are minimized, the employer risks are still there. As an employer, you still want to make sure that you have some sort of, method to your madness relative to your investments. So I would say, yes, I think that a DB plan should consider having an IPS in place. I don't think that the DB plan necessarily, like we said, has the same types of risks out there as the DC plan, but I think it makes all the sense in the world to have one from the perspective of having an organized, methodical perspective for managing and reviewing investments in any retirement plan is never a bad practice.
Excellent, thank you. And I believe we probably have time for one more. What are the most common mistakes plan sponsors make when drafting or updating an IPS?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think I would say inappropriate benchmarks. Like we mentioned before, I just think that there's so many options for benchmarks. And I'll give you an example. Maybe you had one, I keep coming back to the target date fund series because I think it's a relevant example as these assets take up an ever larger chunk of retirement assets. Just to throw one final fun fact out there, there's $3.5 trillion in target date funds. So I think that if you perhaps change the fund series that you offer, maybe you go from one vendor to another vendor, and maybe you don't at least assess and consider updating your benchmark, I think that can be a mistake. And the reason why, sorry, I think I'm probably running up against time here, but the reason why I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people see is because then if you have the wrong benchmark, that's going to throw off all your subsequent monitoring and may make your investments look like they're underperforming or overperforming when they may not necessarily be.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kate, and everyone who attended today's webinar. Any questions we did not get to today, we will follow up with you separately. As a reminder, please complete the survey questions that will pop up on your screen in just a minute, and everyone have a great rest of your day.